is the half-life of carbon-14. If we find 50 C14 atoms, we have a ratio of 2 trillion to 1. In other words, it died over 5,730 years. If we find 3 atoms, it's approximately 28,650 years old. That's how we tell the age. Now I want to ask these two over here a question. If you were in a classroom as a teacher, and you were doing an experiment, let's say you had your students do an experiment on coefficients of linear expansion. An error of 25% in that calculation will collapse a bridge, won't it? It'll bring down a building, won't it? If as a teacher, would you accept an error of 25%, or would you tell the student to redo his experiment?
Well, as a teacher, my response to that would be, it will depend entirely on the nature of what the question is. If it's a bridge collapsing, obviously 25% is too much. Yes.
Yeah, well, coefficient of linear expansion, the bridge expands, it falls off of its monster, doesn't it?
There are certainly cases where a 25% error margin still answers your question very sufficiently, but generally speaking, that's a lot of error.
Dr. Willard Libby, I'm sure you guys are familiar with him. He's the creator of dating by carbon-14. He discovered in his experiments that carbon-14 was created in the atmosphere about 25% faster than it was deteriorating. This was a problem. Dr. Libby's an evolutionist. At that time, he believed that the universe was 2 billion years old. Because in 1955, they estimated the age of the universe at 2 billion years. So what does he do with 25% error? He says we should reach equilibrium in 30,000 years. He believes the universe is 2 billion years old. The Earth is 2 billion years old, and we have not reached equilibrium yet. There's a 25% error. What does he do? Does he go back and redo experiments? Does he try? Does he look? No, he writes it off to experimental error. That's what his report does. Now in the 1960s, those experiments were redone and they found out that 25% really did exist. Dr. Richard Lingfelder, the production of C14 by cosmic ray neurons, published in Review Geophysics, there is strong indication, despite the large errors, that the present natural production rate exceeds the natural decay rate by as much as 25%. See, Libby was right. There's only a problem if we haven't reached equilibrium yet, according to Libby and other scientists. We have to be less than 30,000 years old. Because if we start with 0, according to them, it takes 30,000 years to achieve equilibrium. Dr. Elizabeth K. Ralph and Henry M. Michael, in their publication in American Scientist, not a Creation popular magazine, they said 25 years of radiocarbon dating. They said, we know the assumption that the biospheric inventory of C14 has remained constant over the last 50,000 years or so is not true. If it's not true, your ratios are going to be off. Dr. E. Taylor, major revisions in the Pleistocene age assessment for North American human skeletons, C14, accelerator mass spectrometry. And for those of you who don't know, accelerator mass spectrometry is the newest way to isolate carbon atoms in order to be able to count them to age a fossil. Ancient human skeletons, when dated by the new accelerator mass spectrometer technique, give surprisingly recent dates. In one study of 11 sets of ancient human bones, all were dated at about 5,000 radiocarbon years or less. So Libby ignored his experiments. This new technology tells us that bones that previously were dated at 28 to 38,000 years are only 5,000 years. Dr. Robert E. Lee, yes, boys and girls, his name really is Robert E. Lee. Radio Radiocarbon Ages in Error, the Anthropological Journal of Canada. The troubles of the radiocarbon dating method are undeniably deep and serious. Despite 35 years of technological refinement and better understanding, the underlying assumptions have been strongly challenged. It should be no surprise then that fully half the dates are rejected. The wonder is the remaining half came to be accepted. He goes on, mind you, this man is an evolutionist. The implications of pervasive contamination and ancient variation in carbon-14 levels are steadfastly ignored by those who base their arguments upon the dates. And while the method cannot be counted on to give good unequivocal results, the numbers do impress people and save them the trouble of thinking excessively. What do we know? Carbon-14 has a half-life of 5,730 years. Take a half-life, 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 half-life. What is the maximum number of years we can measure the age of something with carbon-14? 60,000. Not hundreds of thousands, not millions, because by the time you hit 60,000 years, you have nitrogen. You don't have carbon-14 anymore. Your ratio no longer exists. If the ratios are wrong, they're going to give us big problems in dating. What would cause the radiation to be wrong? The ratios, rather, to be wrong. Cloud cover. Many scientists believe that in the early Earth it was covered with clouds, volcanic ash, and water vapor. That's going to affect the amount of radiation coming into the atmosphere. That's going to affect the amount of nitrogen that's becoming carbon-14. What happens if you have a worldwide flood, such as the strata level seems to indicate, with a worldwide strata as deep as it is? You know what's going to happen? You're going to bury billions and billions and billions of tons of plants and animals. You know what that's going to do? That's going to change your carbon ratio. It's going to remove carbon from the atmosphere. And as a result of that, do you know what you're going to get? Dates much, much older than what the things really are. We know for a fact that the ratio wasn't the same. Yet we also know that we're told this is this old by carbon-14, this is that old by carbon-14. But if the ratios aren't accurate, neither is the measurement. As I said before, ignore the experiments. Ignore the observations. The theory must live. You cannot date by strata layer because it's only formed in moving water and it's formed horizontally, which means if something goes down here and something goes down here, if that sank first and that sank last, as the strata moves over, that's going to be lower than that, even though it's actually younger. I don't have time to get into the theories of subjugation where they say, well, this is older and that's younger and this is a date, that doesn't make sense, so this drove under this, and all that other stuff they come up with to explain why the dates don't match, why it really doesn't work. But the fact of the matter is, if you think catastrophe, it does. And it does make sense. But if you can't trust the dating systems, then you can't trust anything that comes out of the evolutionary theory. You've got to go by what is observed. And what is observed says that this Earth is about 7,500 years old. Now, a lot of people don't like that date, and a lot of people mock at it, but quite honestly, I've got the scientific tests and the results of those tests to establish that. And that is far more than the evolutionists can come up with, especially in the light of the fact that every scientist I quote is an evolutionist. Thank you.